imagine you're standing on a forested ridge, right?
Okay, I'm picturing.
You're looking down into a valley. And below you, there is an occupying army moving through. We're talking 50,000 heavily armed troops.
A massive force.
Yeah, exactly. You see miles of supply trucks, armored vehicles, artillery pieces being towed through the mud. It's just this massive industrialized machine of war.
Right.
And then there's you. You have maybe a dozen people, a few crates of stolen explosives, and like some aging rifles.
Not exactly a fair fight.
No. According to every conventional military doctrine, every standard equation of force-on-force mathematics, your group is completely irrelevant. You should be crushed without the enemy commander even, looking up from his coffee.
Well, conventional military math is incredibly comforting to generals, right? Because it relies on tonnage.
Right.
You count your tanks, you count your artillery shells, you count the calories needed to feed your infantry, and whoever has the highest numbers usually wins. It's industrial attrition.
But then you step into the shadow world of unconventional warfare, and suddenly that spreadsheet is completely useless.
Completely useless.
In fact, if you play your cards right, those 50,000 troops are actually at a massive disadvantage.
They really are.
So today on the Deep Dive, we are going to unpack the foundational fundamentals of unconventional warfare.
It's such a fascinating topic.
It really is. We're going to look at the theory of how small bands of outgunned fighters dismantle massive armies. And, more importantly, we're going to look at the messy reality of how this played out historically during World War II.
And we are pulling from some phenomenal historical texts for this deep dive. To lay the groundwork, we are diving into a manual called The Art of Guerrilla Warfare by Colin Gubbins.
A true classic.
Absolutely. But we aren't just taking theory at face value. We will be testing it against the real-world battlefields of Europe using David W. Hogan Jr.'s book, United States Army Special Operations in World War II.
Right, and we'll also be bringing in James D. Kiris's analysis in special operations and strategy.
Exactly. We also want to look at the psychological warfare happening in the Pacific, so we'll use the reports of General MacArthur.
And finally, we're going to look at one of the most successful, terrifying jungle campaigns in history using Troy J. Sackety's research on the Office of Strategic Services Detachment 101.
Those sources offer a perfect contrast. They show us what happens when conventional commanders stubbornly misuse these forces.
And what happens when they finally take the leash off.
Precisely.
So let's start with the blueprint. If you're going to build resistance movement from scratch, you need a rule book.
You definitely do.
And that brings us to Colin Gubbins. Who was he, and why is his manual, The Art of Guerrilla Warfare, the starting point for us today?
So Colin Gubbins was this visionary within the British military establishment. He eventually became a driving force behind the Special Operations Executive. He saw what happened when conventional armies clashed in World War I, and he realized that if Britain was going to support resistance movements against Nazi Germany, they couldn't just hand out rifles and say, go fight.
Right, that would be a disaster.
Complete disaster.
Yeah.
He had to systematize rebellion. He had to explain the actual mechanics of how a weak force bleeds a strong force to death.
And he lays out the primary object of guerrilla warfare right from the start. And it's not about lining up in a field, waving a flag, and defeating the occupying army in a glorious pitched battle.
Oh, no. That is a quick way to get your entire movement wiped out.
Right. His objective is much more insidious. The primary object is to harass the enemy across all occupied territory, constantly and relentlessly.
Until they are physically and logistically incapable of continuing their campaign. It's really about creating a logistical nightmare.
Let's break down the mechanics of that. Because how does a dozen people blowing up a bridge actually stop 50,000 soldiers?
Well, think about the logistical tale of a modern army. Those 50,000 soldiers need thousands of tons of food, ammunition, and medical supplies every single day.
That's a lot of freight.
It is. They need working rail lines, telegraph wires, fuel depots. Gubbins understood that an occupying army can't just sit in a fortress. They have to spread out to control the country.
Right.
So when guerrillas start blowing up train tracks, the enemy has to stop advancing and fix the tracks.
And to protect the engineers fixing the tracks, they have to post guards.
Yes. Suddenly, they are pulling combat troops off the front lines just to guard a lonely stretch of railway in the middle of nowhere.
Wow.
If you blow up enough railways, cut enough telegraph wires, and ambush enough supply convoys, the enemy's combat power is completely diluted. They're paralyzed by their own need for security.
Okay, so you need to build a force capable of causing that paralysis. Gubbins breaks this down into 3 stages of scaling an operation. And it reminds me a lot of, like, scaling a startup business.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Right. You don't build a massive corporate headquarters when you're just 2 people working in a garage.
Exactly.
If you hire a human resources department and a board of directors before you even have a product, you're just bleeding cash and making yourself a bloated target.
That analogy translates perfectly to building a resistance network. Gubbins warns explicitly against premature organization. His first stage is just individuals or very small groups working by absolute stealth on acts of sabotage.
So we're talking about 2 people slipping out at night, cutting a communications wire, and going back to their day jobs as bakers or mechanics.
Precisely. Then stage 2 is slightly larger bands under a nominated leader, using basic military tactics.
Okay.
And stage 3 is the massive campaign-level partisan force.
But wait, military logic dictates that structure wins wars. You need commanders, logistics, communication. Are you saying Gubbins actually wanted these groups to remain unorganized?
He absolutely did, at least in the early stages. He introduces a concept he calls the factor of safety.
The factor of safety.
Right. If a resistance movement organizes too formally too early, they sign their own death warrant. Think about what a military structure actually requires.
Spreadsheets, files.
Exactly. If you organize into platoons and companies, you need a command hierarchy. You need skeleton orders of battle. You need intelligence files, supply ledgers, written orders.
The bureaucracy of war.
And that bureaucracy creates a paper trail. If the enemy's secret police raid a safe house and find a ledger detailing the names and addresses of every platoon commander in the city,
the entire movement is destroyed in a single night.
A centralized structure gives the enemy a single, fatal target.
So by staying decentralized, just loose bands obtaining information by word of mouth, you're building a firewall.
Yes, a perfect firewall.
If one group gets caught, they literally cannot betray the rest of the network because they don't know who or where they are.
The factor of safety is about maintaining the loosest possible organization compatible with effective action. You must protect that firewall until the culminating stages of the war.
When the enemy is already collapsing and you finally need a coordinated army to sweep them out.
Exactly.
But how do these loose, disconnected bands actually govern their combat operations? I mean, if they don't have a general barking orders from a headquarters, they need a shared doctrine.
They do.
And this brings us to what Gubbins calls the 9 points of the guerrilla's creed. And a few of these completely contradict everything a conventional soldier is taught.
They absolutely do, because the rules of engagement are entirely inverted. A conventional soldier is taught to hold the line, to push through contact, to suppress and advance.
But the guerrilla creed throws that out the window.
Completely out the window.
For example, Gubbins says, never undertake an operation unless certain of success. If the action becomes too risky, you break it off immediately.
Right.
But here's the one that really challenges military pride. Never engage in a pitched battle unless in overwhelming strength. And always ensure a secure line of retreat is available.
Yes.
Isn't that just a tactical retreat? Some might even call it cowardice. How does running away win a war?
Well, it's not cowardice. It's recognizing the asymmetrical nature of the fight. If a guerrilla band gets pinned down in a firefight by a conventional platoon, the conventional platoon can call in artillery.
Oh.
They can call in air support. They have reinforcements. The guerrilla has nothing but the ammunition in their pockets. If they get pinned down, they die.
So the goal is immunity.
That is the perfect word for it, immunity. You set an ambush on a mountain road, you hit the enemy convoy, cause massive casualties, steal their weapons, and before their reinforcements can arrive, you vanish into the mountains.
Leaving the enemy shooting at ghosts.
Exactly. Your ability to escape scot-free is incredibly frustrating to the occupying army, and it deeply damages their morale.
I can imagine.
At the same time, it's incredibly encouraging to the local inhabitants. It shows them the enemy can bleed, and that resistance is actually possible.
That transitions us beautifully into the most vital component of this entire theory. We can talk about ambushes and lone train tracks all day long, but avoiding pitched battles implies you have somewhere to hide.
Right, you can't just vanish into thin air.
You have to vanish into the local population. And if the population doesn't support you, you are completely exposed.
Without the local population, a guerrilla is just a fugitive. To understand this dynamic, we are turning to the reports of General MacArthur regarding the guerrilla activities in the Philippines during World War II.
The Philippine resistance provides a masterclass in the psychological front of unconventional warfare. When the Japanese occupied the Philippines, they obviously wanted a compliant population.
Of Of course.
They wanted the civilians to just put their heads down, farm the land, and accept the new management. And honestly, for a civilian just trying to keep their family alive, that is a very tempting offer.
The occupying force always offers the illusion of peace in exchange for submission. The MacArthur reports show how the resistance leadership fought a desperate psychological battle to prevent the population from accepting that offer.
They had to convince ordinary citizens to endure immense hardship, starvation, and the constant threat of execution just to maintain their honor.
There is a specific quote from the reports that is just chilling.
Yeah, the resistance leaders were warning the people against accepting what they called the, quote, ignominious peace of a dumb animal like a caribou.
A caribou is a domestic water buffalo used for farming in the Philippines. It's a beast of burden.
Right. They were essentially telling the public, yes, you can have peace right now. You can have tranquility, but it will cost you your humanity.
Powerful message.
The enemy will put a yoke around your neck, and you will plow their fields until you drop. You'll be living beneath the dignity of a human being. It's such a stark, polarizing message.
It was necessary to weaponize the people's will. Gubbins talks about this in his manual as well. The people's will to war must be sapped from the enemy and turned against them.
How do you do that practically?
You organize whispering campaigns. You start rumors that the occupying army is losing on other fronts. You organize boycotts of enemy-run businesses.
You basically create a sea of absolute non-cooperation.
Exactly. You make the occupation fundamentally ineffective because the civilian population simply refuses to be governed. The people act as the eyes and ears of the guerrillas.
Right.
They provide food, they hide the wounded, and they offer a wall of silence that the enemy's secret police cannot penetrate.
So the blueprint is brilliant. Start small, protect your network with a decentralized structure, never fight a fair fight, and weaponize the local population to hide you and feed you.
Yes.
But theory is always clean, right? A manual written at a desk doesn't account for the massive egos and bureaucratic friction of a real war. How well do the Allied commanders actually execute these principles on the ground in Europe?
This is where we see a catastrophic collision between unconventional theory and conventional military culture.
Really?
Yeah. If we look at David W. Hogan Jr.'s text on the United States Army's special operations, we see a massive, deeply ingrained reluctance to adapt.
I just don't understand that reluctance. You're fighting the Axis powers. The fate of the free world is on the line. Why wouldn't conventional generals want every possible tool, including guerrillas, at their disposal?
Well, to understand their mindset, you have to look at the interwar years, the 1920s and 1930s. Pre-war military planners in the United States and the United Kingdom were entirely fixated on mass warfare.
Okay.
They were looking back at the meat grinder of World War I, and they were looking forward to the development of massive armored columns and heavy bomber fleets.
Big machines.
Yeah.
Millions of men moving in synchronized formations.
Exactly. The entire military culture was heavily focused on logistics, mobilization plans, and technological innovations.
Yeah.
Unconventional operations with all their elements of stealth relying on civilians, secrecy, and messy political complications seemed completely foreign.
Right.
Hogan describes the interwar Army officer corps as this ordered, gentlemanly world. They played polo, they played bridge, they studied the sweeping maneuvers of the American Civil War. To an officer trained to fight force on force, guerrilla tactics seemed devious. Some even viewed it as dishonorable.
That culture clash resulted in some incredibly bizarre situations when the United States finally did decide to stand up special operations forces like the Office of Strategic Services.
Oh, absolutely.
The detail in Hogan's book about the early training for their operational groups is almost surreal.
Because the conventional army had largely ignored the concept of guerrilla warfare, when they finally needed to train these units, they were essentially building the airplane while flying it. They had no institutional knowledge.
They took these highly motivated recruits guys who were volunteering to jump behind enemy lines into occupied Europe, and they sent them to the Congressional Country Club outside Washington.
A literal luxury golf course.
Right. Picture this. You were training for brutal, behind-the-lines partisan warfare, where if you're captured, you will be tortured and executed. And your morning physical training consists of running conditioning drills on the plush putting greens of a country club.
It's absurd.
And the officers instructing them were literally reading the British manuals the night before, just trying to stay one lesson ahead of the recruits.
It highlights how entirely unprepared the American military infrastructure was for this type of war.
But then, to contrast that completely, they take these same recruits and ship them out to a former civilian conservation corps camp deep in the woods of Virginia.
Right, a totally different environment.
There, they were handed over to a grizzled regular army sergeant or someone who had trained with the British commandos. Suddenly, they're doing rigorous demolitions, practicing hand-to-hand killing techniques, and conducting night navigation through swamps.
Pre-shift.
It was this jarring transition from the gentlemanly theory of the country club to the brutal reality of the woods.
And that tension between conventional military minds trying to manage unconventional tools did not stop at the training camps. It bled directly into how these forces were deployed on the battlefield.
Right.
And we see the most tragic example of this during the Normandy campaign.
Let's dig into James D. Kears's analysis of the Special Air Service during Normandy. The Special Air Service, these elite British parachutists who specialized in behind-the-lines sabotage, had unbelievable potential.
They really did.
According to the Gubbins blueprint, their job should have been to inflict strategic attrition.
Right. Strategic attrition means isolating the entire theater of war. They should have been dropped hundreds of miles behind the beaches of Normandy, deep into France.
Okay.
Their mission should have been to target the massive rail networks, the telephone exchanges, and the main supply arteries of the German army. If you destroy the rail yards in eastern France, German tank divisions cannot even reach the Normandy beaches.
Using the Special Air Service at the front lines instead of deep in the rear is like trying to stop a flood by bailing water out of your living room with a bucket.
That's a great way to put it.
Instead of just walking 5 miles upstream and using explosives to fix the dam.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it. You have this highly specialized, delicate instrument, and the Allied conventional commanders just use them as a bucket. Wow. Kears points out that instead of causing strategic attrition, they were used for haphazard attacks right near the front lines. They were dropped close to the invasion beaches to act as speed bumps against German reinforcements.
Or even used in direct tactical support of advancing conventional infantry?
Exactly.
Why? Why would a theater commander take an elite saboteur and tell him to act like a standard infantryman?
Kears explains this through the friction of strategy. Conventional force planners simply couldn't let go of their traditional doctrines. They traded the crucial element of surprise, which, as Gubbins stated, is the absolute foundation of the guerrilla creed for mass.
Right.
They insisted on using special operations forces to plug immediate tactical gaps in the conventional line. Furthermore, you had intense bureaucratic rivalries.
Of course.
The conventional Army, Navy, and Air Force commanders all lobbied to ensure their branches had control over the battlefield, often treating the Special Operations Forces as an unwanted nuisance or, like, a neat toy to be squandered.
But the most frustrating part of the Normandy failure wasn't just the tactical misuse. It was how operational security actively crippled their ability to work with the French resistance.
Yes. The High Command had a dogmatic, almost paranoid insistence on operational security regarding the D-Day landings.
Which makes sense on the surface, right? If the Germans know where and when you're landing, the invasion fails and tens of thousands of men die on the beaches. Secrecy is paramount.
Secrecy is paramount, but they took it to an extreme that prevented any meaningful coordination. Because the conventional commanders were terrified of the invasion plans leaking, they severely restricted the Special Air Service from properly organizing the French resistance in advance.
They couldn't even talk to them.
They were not allowed to communicate their objectives to the local partisans until the very last minute.
But wait, going back to Gubbins, the whole point of the blueprint is that you need time.
Yes.
You need to study the territory, build the network slowly, establish secure lines of supply, and build trust with the local population. You can't just drop out of the sky at midnight on D-Day, find a French farmer, and expect a massive, coordinated partisan army to instantly materialize.
You cannot. And because of that paranoia, the result in Normandy was isolated, uncoordinated raids. The Special Air Service fought with incredible bravery, but they were flying blind.
That's heartbreaking.
They didn't have the deep logistical networks of the French resistance prepared to support them. Because they were managed by conventional minds who did not understand the required factor of safety and the need for slow integration, they failed to achieve the massive moral and material attrition against the German forces that they were theoretically capable of.
So if Europe showed us the disaster of conventional commanders misusing special operations, treating them like infantry and ignoring the local resistance until it was too late, what happens when you actually let the experts run the show?
Now that is the real question.
What happens when unconventional warfare is perfectly adapted to the terrifying terrain, the local people, and the strategic necessity.
To see the perfect application of the doctrine, we have to shift our focus entirely. We have to leave the plains of Europe and look at the Pacific, specifically the brutal realities of the China-Burma-India Theater.
Let's set the stage using Troy J. Sackety's article. The strategic situation the Allies faced in Burma was nothing short of a nightmare. I want you to picture the geography here.
It is arguably one of the most complex, hostile fighting environments on the planet during World War II.
We're talking about steep, unexplored mountainous terrain covered in thick, secondary growth jungle. It's an environment where the jungle itself is trying to kill you.
Absolutely.
Men were being decimated by acute dysentery. They were suffering from scrub typhus, which is transmitted by microscopic mites in the vegetation and causes massive fevers and organ failure.
It was horrific.
The monsoon rains were so relentless that the humidity would literally rot a pair of combat boots off a soldier's feet in a week. Leeches were dropping from the canopy. And in the middle of this green hell, the Allies had to fight an enemy that was deeply entrenched.
The Japanese 18th Division controlled North Burma, and these were not green, untested recruits. This was the exact same hardened, veteran force that had captured Singapore and sacked Nanking in China. They were elite jungle fighters.
And they had achieved their strategic goal. They had completely cut off the Burma Road.
Right.
For context, the Burma Road was the main overland supply route pouring weapons and fuel into China. By cutting it, the Japanese effectively isolated the Chinese army.
Which is a massive strategic problem.
Right, because if China collapsed and surrendered, the Japanese could redirect millions of their soldiers away from the Asian mainland and throw them directly into the Pacific Islands against the Americans.
Exactly.
So the Allies desperately needed to reopen a land route. They needed to secure a city called Myitkyina, which had a vital airfield.
They needed that airfield to protect the aerial supply route over the Himalayas, the famous hump airlift. And they needed to secure the surrounding terrain to build a brand new overland route called the Lido Road.
But how do you push a massive engineering project like a road through disease-ridden mountains while being hunted by elite Japanese infantry?
It's an impossible problem.
Right. It was an impossible problem for conventional forces to solve alone. General Joseph Stilwell, who commanded the Northern Combat Area Command, was desperately short on reliable combat troops. He had elements of the Chinese army in India, but their political leadership back in China was incredibly obstructionist and hesitant to commit them to battle.
So Stilwell needed a wild card. He needed something that didn't play by conventional rules.
Enter the Office of Strategic Services Detachment 101.
Yes. Detachment 101 is the shining model of how to execute unconventional warfare correctly. Unlike the generals in Europe, the leadership of Detachment 101 understood Gubbins' manual. They perfectly executed the phased approach.
They didn't just parachute in with machine guns and start blindly ambushing Japanese patrols.
No, they started with Phase 1. Pure, methodical intelligence gathering.
Long before the main Allied offensive even began, they infiltrated tiny 2 to 3 man teams deep behind Japanese lines. They lived in the jungle. They established a clandestine network.
Yeah.
They found local agents to sit by roadsides and count Japanese supply trucks.
Oh.
But my favorite detail from Sackety's article is how they solved the problem of the hidden bridges.
The hidden bridges are a perfect example of why you need eyes on the ground, regardless of how good your technology is.
The Allies had air superiority. The United States Army Air Forces were flying reconnaissance missions constantly.
Yeah.
But the jungle canopy is like an ocean. It hides everything beneath it.
Right.
The Japanese engineers were brilliant. They knew Allied planes were looking for targets, so when they built bridges across the Burmese rivers, they built the roadbed 18 inches below the surface of the river water.
So from the air, a bomber pilot looking down just sees a continuous flowing river. The water masks the structure completely.
Exactly. But the local agents recruited by Detachment 101 were on the ground. They were sitting in the brush, watching Japanese supply convoys drive right into the river and seemingly drive across the water.
Whoa.
The agents would hike back to a hidden camp, tap out the exact coordinates on a hand-cranked radio, and transmit it back to headquarters. The next day, the bombers would arrive and blow a bridge they couldn't even see.
The effectiveness of this intelligence network is staggering. Sackety notes that up to mid-March of 1944, Detachment 101 provided 80% of the targeting intelligence for the United States Army Air Forces in that region.
80%.
80%. They were effectively the eyes of the entire air campaign.
But intelligence was only Phase 1. Phase 2 was building an army. And the local population in North Burma meant the Kachin people.
The Kachin warriors were the perfect indigenous partners for this type of war. They naturally despised the Japanese occupation, which had been incredibly brutal to their villages.
Makes sense.
Furthermore, they were master trackers and hunters who knew every single trail, ravine, and water source in that terrifying jungle terrain.
They didn't fight like conventional soldiers, and Detachment 1 didn't force them to. They embraced the Kachin's native, brutal, highly expedient tactics.
Yeah.
One of the most horrifying details from the source involves how the Kachins would manipulate a firefight. They used panjis, which are needle-sharp bamboo stakes, often coated in animal waste to ensure infection. The Kachins would hide these stakes in the dense brush lining the jungle trails.
When a Japanese patrol walked down the trail, the Kachins would initiate an ambush with rifle fire. What is a soldier's immediate drilled instinct when taking fire on an open trail?
You dive off the trail into the brush for cover.
Right into the hidden panji stakes. It was a psychological nightmare for the Japanese. It got to the point where Japanese soldiers, even when taking heavy machine gun fire, actively refused to take cover.
They would rather just stand there.
They would just stand paralyzed on the exposed trail because the hidden terror in the jungle was vastly more terrifying than the visible bullets.
That is the psychological front operating at maximum efficiency. A report from the Office of Strategic Services at the time noted that a single Kachin warrior armed with a traditional short sword, which they called a da, was the equivalent of a whole panzer division in his own country.
Let the weight of that statement sink in. One man with a sword operating in his home environment, holding the psychological weight of a German tank division.
It's unbelievable.
The casualty rates for Japanese troops venturing into Kachin territory were immense. The sources indicate that Japanese soldiers actively refused to volunteer for patrols against the Kachins because they suffered a 50% casualty rate.
Half the men who went into the jungle didn't come back.
It completely paralyzed Japanese maneuverability.
So Detachment 101 has this incredible intelligence network, and they've organized this lethal indigenous guerrilla force that is psychologically breaking the Japanese.
Right.
But how do they tie that back to the big picture? A bunch of blown bridges and terrified patrols don't build the Lido Road. How did they help the conventional army actually take ground?
This is where we see the seamless integration that was completely missing in the Normandy campaign. Detachment 101 became the crucial connective tissue between their guerrilla forces and the conventional Allied units moving into the jungle.
We're talking about the famous American unit known as Merrill's Marauders and the British long-range penetration groups known as the Chindits.
They didn't just operate in separate vacuums. Detachment 101 embedded liaison officers directly with those conventional forces.
Rather than hoarding their intelligence out of a dogmatic fear of operational security like the commanders in Europe did, Detachment 101 officers fed real-time, ground-level intelligence directly to the conventional commanders. They provided Kachin scouts to act as guides.
Because the Kachins knew exactly where the Japanese strongpoints were, they could guide Merrill's marauders right around them. It's like having a radar system in a jungle where you usually cannot see 10 feet in front of your own face.
Incredible.
The conventional forces were able to completely bypass heavily defended roadblocks, maneuver behind the Japanese lines, and launch devastating surprise attacks.
And when the conventional forces needed to keep moving, they didn't have to leave troops behind to guard their rear. The Kachins stayed behind, acting as a screening force.
Right.
They continued to harass the retreating enemy, cut their supply lines, and even operated a massive rescue network for downed Allied pilots. It was a perfect ecosystem of warfare.
The guerrillas provided the intelligence and the constant harassment, causing that strategic attrition Gubbins talked about. This allowed the conventional forces to conserve their strength, avoid ambushes, and strike the decisive blows exactly where they mattered.
It's an incredible contrast. You look at Europe, where conventional commanders tried to force unconventional troops to fight like standard infantry, prioritizing operational secrecy over integration, and they lost their strategic impact.
Yes.
Then you look at Burma, where the unconventional forces were allowed to fight like guerrillas. They built the network slowly, they embraced the factor of safety, they weaponized the local population, and they acted as a lever that moved the entire theater of war.
It proves the thesis from the manual entirely. Unconventional warfare requires a completely different mindset. You cannot apply conventional force-on-force mathematics to a shadow war.
Right.
It requires trusting local knowledge, embracing incredibly loose organization in the early phases, and valuing psychological terror and logistical paralysis over sheer firepower.
So let's bring this all together. What does this deep dive mean for someone trying to wrap their head around how conflicts actually work beneath the surface?
The core takeaway from synthesizing all these historical texts, from Gubbins' theoretical blueprint to the rocky application in Europe and the masterful execution in Asia, is that unconventional warfare is not a chaotic series of random sabotages.
No.
It is a highly deliberate, meticulously scaled, and fundamentally psychological strategy.
It relies entirely on using the right tool for the right job. You don't use a delicate surgical scalpel to chop firewood like they did in Normandy.
Exactly.
You don't build a massive, easily targetable corporate structure for a tiny resistance startup operating in hostile territory. And most importantly, you absolutely have to weaponize the will of the local population.
That's the key.
Whether that means convincing the people of the Philippines to reject the peace of the Carabao and embrace the hardship of resistance, or harnessing the unparalleled hunting skills of the Kachin warriors to turn the Burmese jungle into a nightmare for the Japanese.
The ultimate success of the massive conventional army often rests entirely on the invisible, grueling work done by those small bands operating in the shadows.
And that leads to a final provocative thought. We just spent this time looking at how, during World War II, highly motivated local resistance and incredibly small specialized forces could completely paralyze the world's most massive, heavily armed conventional armies.
Right.
They did it with stealth, surprise, and local knowledge.
A fascinating historical reality.
But think about the nature of warfare today. We live in an era of constant surveillance. We have drones that can loiter in the sky for days. We have satellite imaging that can read a license plate from orbit.
It's a different world.
We have thermal optics that can see the body heat of a single person hiding in a dense forest. Technology theoretically makes everyone visible on the modern battlefield.
The shadows are rapidly shrinking.
So how does the history we just discussed change how we view modern conflicts? If a single Kachin warrior with a sword could carry the weight of a tank division because he had the absolute element of surprise and an unbreakable human will.
Does modern technology truly erase that advantage?
Exactly. Or, in an age where machines can see everything, do the human mind, the will of a local population, and the chaotic element of surprise remain the ultimate unbeatable wildcards? Can you ever truly conquer a population that simply refuses to be governed?
That is the exact question that military planners and strategists are undoubtedly still wrestling with right now. The technology changes, but the human element of war remains stubbornly complex.
Something to keep in mind the next time you look at the raw numbers of a military conflict. The math rarely tells the whole story. Thank you for joining us for the Doctrine Deep Dive. Keep questioning the consensus, and we will catch you on the next one.